Ready? Okay. Welcome, everyone. Oh, perfect. Okay, welcome, everyone. We're excited to see such a big and full audience. If you are here with some of the communication classes, be sure to check in with your faculty member. There may be specific directions for you. If you're with Brother Dave's class, he has informed me there's a special assignment on Canvas. We would also love for folks to fill out the survey on the backs of the chairs with the QR code. If you can't access that, it looks like they're posted around the room as well. You are in for a real treat today. Today we're going to talk about communication and ethics across cultures. And with me today is Dr. Maria Blevins, Dr. Rawat, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Robinson. They are going to share with you some really fun and exciting perspectives related to ethics. So I think without further ado, I'll let Dr. Blevins get started.
All right, so one of my areas of study is conflict, and I think ethics and conflict go together so beautifully. And you might be thinking, conflict, how does that fit in communication? But I would make the argument that often our conflict manifests through communication, right? We know if someone is a little cheesed off at us because of their nonverbals, right? They might be giving you some looks that we all know how to interpret, or often we have to talk through conflicts, the way that rooms are set up, right? These are all forms of communication, and I'll go into conflict. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about two concepts that I think are at the heart of conflict and ethics, and that's power and narrative. So before we start, I just want you to take like 30 seconds and think of a conflict that perhaps you're involved in right now, one that has weighed heavy on your mind. If you are a person right now that is conflict-free, think of one in a movie or a TV show, but think of a conflict that you are familiar with. Think about who is involved, what happened, at what point did it escalate? Maybe it hasn't escalated yet, maybe it's in you and you're like, how am I gonna approach this? Okay, hopefully you have a conflict in mind. We're gonna put a pin and pause on that. We will come back to it. So the first thing I want to talk about is power, and I'm also gonna talk about the concept of narrative. So, how does power show up in conflict? Well, no one likes to feel like they don't have power. So we are always looking for ways to express how we have power in this world, right? And so how often are conflicts about, hey, I feel like I'm powerless here. I feel like I asked for this day off months ago, and now you, my manager, are expressing your power and making that not happen, and I have this really important family event, or this event that's really important to me that I'm gonna be missing. So I think often when conflicts manifest, it's moments when either we are feeling powerless and we want to express that power, or it's moments that maybe we have a lot of power and we're wielding it without thinking about how our power might be impacting someone else. And I think that these are really ethical questions. So there are a few kinds of power currencies. So just off the top of your head, who are some of the most powerful people you can think of? Some of you are really primed for this because we just talked about this. Who's powerful in your world?
President.
The President of the United States, right? Jeff Bezos delivers things to my house every day. Yes.
My parents.
Your parents, absolutely, right? They maybe offer you emotional support. Maybe they offer you material support. Maybe they're helping support you through school. Brother Dave, right? Right? He might get you with the power of ideas, the power of thought, and also he has the power to fail you, right? That is power, that is real power. All of us, all 5 of us have that. So there are 5 kinds of power currencies that we think of. Designated power is one. So when we go to the President of the United States, that is designated power. We have voted that person into office. Brother Dave has designated power. He is the professor of the class, and there are responsibilities and power that comes with that. There's resource control. So we talked about parents, perhaps resource control. They might be helping you get through college. Bezos is some resource control, right? I want my package today, dude. And of course, this is We look nationally, there's actually a big conversation happening about how things are sold, how Amazon is reacting ethically. Interpersonal linkage. Now this is one I love to give a whoop whoop for all the comm students in the room, right? Being able to connect with people in a meaningful way is a form of power. So you can think of the person on your softball team that can talk everyone into where they want to go for milkshakes after the game, right? That person has power, and it is often we can think of in our organizations the person that has a lot of power because they have the interpersonal linkage. You know that they have the good office goss. You know that they are the person that is like connected to other folks and can connect you maybe to networks that are important for you. And that also goes with communication skills. Again, a shout out to where that works. If I can come to you with a conflict, is there a difference between, and Professor Hanson, I'm going to call you out. Professor Hanson, you're doing a terrible job teaching right now. P.S. Not true, right? Is there a difference between that statement and, Professor Hanson, I've seen that maybe your classes are running wild in the halls. Is there a thing I can do to support you? Does that feel differently? To be clear, Kim and I go back 20 years, so I'm picking on her for a very reason. The way that you begin to engage in a conflict can have a gigantic difference in the way that someone is receptive to that. So your communication skills are a form of power. And then expertise, right? All 5 of us are invited here because we think about something deeply in a specific way. I know that when my sink is clogged up, there is one person that has power in my life. It's that plumber, and if I can get a hold of them and if they can come help me use my sink again, right? That expertise is really important. So this is the first thing I want you to think about. What kinds of powers do you have in your life, and how does that impact the way that you are engaging in conflict? And how do these powers, how can you wield them ethically, right? How can you use these powers to benefit the people in your communities, the people in your world, and how can you use these powers to infringe on them? There are 3 kinds of power, right? You can have power over, and that is where I am in charge, you are not. There can be both and power, where I have power and you have power, and together we can create something together. And then there's either or power, so you either have power or I have power, but we can't both have power. And so think about, how do you approach power? How are you thinking about power? And there are different ethics, right? Between if I believe I have power over you and that is going to be my way or the highway, or we are going to co-create something. I want you to think about the fact that power is systematic, right? We are operating within systems. People with power get their way more. Brother Dave is going to get his way more than you are, right? That is just a reality. And again, we've been friends a long time. I can call him out. It's changing in a dynamic way. Right now, Brother Dave might have that power, but when you become president of the United States, right, you're going to have more power, and then Brother Dave is going to, be glad that he wielded his power ethically. We have different perceptions of power, right? I might be thinking that we have both and power, and you might be thinking that I have power over, and so we are going to be analyzing our conflict in a different way, and it is always unbalanced, right? And so when we keep those things in mind, we can really see how power, ethics, and conflict are all woven together. All right, the next thing is power is in the hands of the narrator. So narrative theory is the idea that humans are storytelling creatures, that we make sense of the world through stories. And who is the hero of your story, I hope? You are, right? Absolutely. So how does that impact conflict? If you're the hero, then that person that you're in conflict with might be the villain, right? And what I would do, I know my time is closing up here and I want to give all these other great speakers their chance, but what I want to do is encourage you to think about what happens when you switch that narration. What happens when you tell the story of a conflict from the other person's perspective? So I had you begin this class activity or this symposium activity by thinking of a conflict. I want you to now retell that conflict from the other party's point of view. And I want you to think about how that changes it and how that changes the power dynamic of that story. So just remember that every conflict is a story that we're telling. If we get the honor of being the narrator, that impacts that story in some very real ways. And that influences the ethics of how that story is being told. So with that said, I will say thank you so much for this time, and I look forward to the rest of these awesome discussions.
Can you share the power of the clicker, please?
Oh, yes. No resource control.
Okay, so when I was planning this presentation, initially I was going to talk about the LDS Church's approved art that was going to be held in, or was supposed to be placed in foyers of churches across the world. And as I looked at that art, and started doing a little bit of research on that, I noticed that the only picture that had a person truly of color was this picture of Jesus holding a little African child, looks like somewhere in the Serengeti. And so I started noticing some church news stories about Africa, and kind of changed my direction to look more at representations of Africans and African church members, and how that relates to ethic responsibilities of representing others, especially in developing countries. So the theoretical grounds for my research is based on a treatise published by Said in 1978 called Orientalism. And here he talks about the distinction made by European writers and scientists in the 19th century between Occidents or Western Europeans and those of the Orient, which would primarily not just be like Asiatic countries, but also Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. What he notes in his book here are ways in which colonizers in the 19th century created particular mythologies about people from these other countries. And he argued that colonial imperialism would not have been possible without reductive statements and stereotypes about people from these nations. So amongst those stereotypes and reductive statements, you can see a pattern there of the sorts of false impressions that are made about these people. One being that they're not as capable as governing themselves, that they are primitive, and that their culture or civilization is a result of poor government or poor forms of thinking, and they just can't govern themselves. They need the European powers to govern them. So let's move forward now and look at some tropes now and how they've been reflected in church news stories. So the Latter-day Saint Church has been celebrating its growth a lot in Africa in recent years, and also a lot of charitable work that it does on the continent, which are all good things. But Orientalism can also create or draw from the perception of positive stereotypes. So if you look at these stereotypes here, right? Here's a quote from at the top here, saying, now is a time of great transition across Africa. Cultural traditions are breaking down. People are migrating to the cities. In a new and unfamiliar environment with very little to hold on to, they become more responsive to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So here you have this positive stereotype of the people somehow being humbled, losing their culture, right? Becoming more encultured by colonialistic ideas, and that's a positive thing because it will therefore lead to their conversion. This quote is from Elder Setati, who is a former general authority for the LDS Church, but he's also a manager of the world's fourth largest, or strategy manager of the world's fourth largest oil conglomerate. So clearly he came from a position of power before he became a general authority. This quote from Elder Scott here, the African people are kind and patient people. They don't have a lot of income or resources to allow them financially to do things, so they just do them out of sheer effort. They will walk miles and miles and miles to accomplish something that they are prompted to do by the Holy Ghost, right? So here we have these stereotypes, these tropes of people of Black Africa being primitive in many ways, right? The other issue that I saw rising was the commodification of African church members. In other words, focusing on numbers and conversion rates, and sometimes in a way that reflects colonial othering. So for example, the church highlights here on the right side of the slide that you see, they show the growth of the church in Africa is 121%. Now that's a great percentage, but it's based on a very small population to begin with. Does that make sense? So if you double 100,000 people, that's not the same as doubling, 2 million people. But one of the Church News articles said that Africa is one of the fastest growing areas of the church, which has some 320,000 members, which is true. About 230,000 of those people live in Nigeria. But that number makes up less than 0.02% of the African population. So it's somewhat deceptive in that it suggests, right, that the church is more influential than it really is. But the issue here, I think, is that it's worthy to celebrate growth of the church and so on, but sometimes they go off on the wrong path. So you'll notice that that bottom quote there, African diversity is showcased in the world-famous Tabernacle Choir. So the story was actually, there it is. There's the African. It's a white man from South Africa. And so I think they missed the boat on this one, right? Celebrating diversity, talking about Africa and diversity in the church, and then having a story about a white person from South Africa singing. I think that was a mistake. Finally, we have other Western prosperity tropes, and I think this is especially problematic and raises some ethical questions. All three elements of the Orient myth are exacerbated by economic disparity, while pushing for those who are occupied by colonists to adapt and adopt their superior way of economic exchange. And so some of these quotes here link prosperity to the mythology of gospel prosperity, this idea that if people convert to Christianity or to a particular faith tradition, that they will become prosperous. I'll let you kind of look through these quotes to yourself, but you'll see, in one case, they're talking about learning self-reliance. And the second quote is about Isaac, who worked as a gardener, and after his baptism and following church teachings, he was able to get a better job and become more successful, and now he owns his own business. And the third quote was about Shem, who lost his job after joining the church, but thank goodness for the Relief Society, which taught him and his wife how to build a business, and now they have a thriving catering business, right? So these are all success stories, but again, they reinforce the mythology of black Africans who lack, on the one hand, self-reliance without the faith, without the church to help them. And on the other hand, right, we note the contradictory discourse that, they're humble and hard workers, and yet their humbleness or humility and hard work isn't enough, right? They need to find something else to help them become prosperous. So in conclusion, I just thought, when a global's faith identity and leadership are predominantly a product of Western, North American, Occidental culture, paired with a heavy dose of Republican-leaning white male leaders, primarily from the Mountain West, what are some ways that we can perhaps challenge or rethink how the church might celebrate or represent its identity and success stories about members of its church across the globe without relying on colonial myths of the 19th century? And I just want to end with those questions on the slide there, some things to consider and hopefully move on a path toward a better way of representation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dave, because I think this was a really good way for us to think more globally about power and ethics that, Maria kind of started talking about power with, power over, etc. And then going into a global scale and thinking about development work and what that may look like and how power is wielded in development sector and how the ethics play around it. So my research has been really central into this area of what does it mean to fund developing countries and help them make their lives better, right? And in some ways, infrastructure challenges are, truthfully, there are ways in which they can be improved. There can be more investment in those infrastructural ways in a lot of different parts of our world. And a lot of Western countries, specifically the United States, which actually is very charitable and funds a lot of initiatives, is at the center of this and how they fund different initiatives and what kind of funding narratives they have around it. So what I will focus today is on menstrual health, because my research has been really focused on health issues and how organizations manage health issues. So if you may not know, but United Nations has Sustainable Development Goals 2030, and they have been really widely publicized. And one of the main goals that they have also in those 30 goals that they have, one of them is menstrual hygiene and access to sanitary napkins and menstrual health for women, right? So they have this as one of their goals and have been working very actively in promoting that across different parts of the world. Specifically India, where I come from, is one of the regions where menstrual health and menstruation plays a very different kind of cultural understanding and than just a biological activity that happens to our bodies. And you may all take a moment to reflect on what your experience was when you started menstruating, the women here, of course, I'm talking about, or when you knew about your sister or your girlfriend menstruating, like what were your experiences? What did you understand about menstruation? Because when I started menstruating, I did not know what it meant. And I did not know why we do that. So I was like, I have cancer, I'm gonna die, and this is the end of everything. I was explained that was not going to happen, and that was great, and I survived. However, this continues to be a problem in a lot of parts of India where I'm from, specifically when you go to rural parts, and even in urban parts where they don't know what menstruation means. But one of the biggest push that international agencies and the UN have been doing in India and other countries is, how about we push women to use more pads? And this is just an example from a source from BBC, which shows that food costs in India for rupees 10, right? I can't even convert, it's like few cents. So, and then a pack of sanitary napkins, which is what you may use in a given month of periods, cost about rupees 30. And for someone who is from a very poor family or does not have the resources to keep buying napkins or have plenty of daughters who are menstruating at the same time, they are probably using other means to manage their sanitary needs. So that continues to be a big need that somehow has been overlooked in the past. And while there is more attention to it right now, there still needs to be enough information and attention to it. It's kind of very small fonts, but I just wanted to kind of talk about how India has been reporting that there is improvement in menstrual health hygiene. And numbers do show that. When you talk to people, there is more people who are using sanitary napkins. They're not using cloth anymore. Cloth was a big way in which people manage their menstruation and still do. And there has been a lot of pushback from activists in India who are saying, why are you pushing back on cloth? Like, cloth can be used in a very effective manner if you have ways, if you tell people how to wash those cloths or reuse them in a good way, because that can be more sustainable than using sanitary napkins, because then they need to be disposed. And if you are living in a very rural community where disposing your products is a hard matter, then that is something that you are just littering your place with pads, or you're clogging your toilets that are already non-existent in functioning because they don't have running water with pads. So there has been a lot of reports that we need water and other sanitation facilities. We don't just need pads to be promoted and sold. A lot of big companies and conglomerates have jumped on that, right? Free pads in schools if you are taught about menstruation. So there was a recent report in 2023 from The Hindu, which is one of the top newspapers in India. One of the things they said was, while India continues to improve on this, social taboos also continue to hamper some of the efforts that are not looked into. And what are social taboos? Some of the social taboos that are broadly in some North Indian and South Indian families is, people shouldn't go into temples when they're menstruating because they're impure, or the blood is in general impure, so you shouldn't touch things in the house, or if you wash things immediately. And imagine 5 days of the month when you're constantly washing everything you sit on because you were told to. So those taboos still hesitate people from asking for support, or even recognizing how their body undergoes different emotions and different physical activities when those hormones change. So one of the things I have focused on my research is to try and talk to women and ask them questions like, okay, what are you doing differently? What did you learn about menstruation? Did you learn about any emotions, or did you learn about any psychological factors as well that goes along with menstruating? What was the messages you were given, and how does that make you manage your menstruation now? And it was nice to see that people were doing their best, but it kind of seemed like a very individualized local effort, that even in schools, they were not given the right sex ed, or in colleges, maybe in gender classes, they learned about certain things, and then their opinions changed on how they can navigate their health. but they were not given those tools when they were younger. So when they were younger, they were told, just hush it up, don't talk to anybody, don't tell anyone what you're experiencing. Your pain will go away once you get married. And that's kind of a very weird message, because it basically means once you start having sexual intercourse, your pain will go away. And that does not make much sense, because I spoke to participants where a wife who was experiencing menstrual health challenges and was not menstruating for the last 3 or 4 months said she hadn't spoken to her husband about it because there was so much shame about talking about periods in her that was instilled. So she was not discussing a crucial health matter with her partner. And to just conclude this, while I'm talking about how it globally is a problem, even back home in the United States, some of the research I've done, taboos exist. Having access to sanitary napkins is important. And in a country like the United States, where taboos are kind of, depending on what kind of families you come from or what messaging you're getting, sanitary napkins are an essential part, or getting access to them are an essential part of our living. I'm glad that UVU has those access, and a lot of schools in Utah now have that access. But what I would like you all to think about is, when you are putting in money, or when you are promoting certain activities globally, what kind of views do you need to think about when you're doing that? Do you need to not talk to local people about that? Do you not need to get more ideas about how they are experiencing a challenge? Because that's somewhere that peace has been missing for a long time in development work and needs to change with time. So thank you so much, and I'll leave you with that question.
Sorry, too many things. Hold on. I need a timer, or I will just prattle on about the first slide and never stop. Okay. So, hi everybody. Bro Dave just pointed out that I should start my timer. That's helpful. Okay, so I primarily study video games. I am primarily an identity and gender scholar, so representation in game spaces, especially as a woman gamer myself, are very important to me. So I'm actually going to start off with some questions for y'all. And it's okay if you're not gamers or you have no idea, but I'm actually curious what y'all think. I want some audience participation here. So what percentage of Americans do you think play video games regularly? That would be 4 hours a week or more. 35%, okay. 45? 70? Closer. 85? It's actually a little bit lower than 70. I have a box up here with the actual numbers in a sec. How many gamers do you think are men, women, non-binary people?
Half of women.
Half women, okay, so about 50% women. I love that nobody wants to give the balance one way or the other. It's not 50-50. It's a little bit out of whack. On average, how many hours a week do you think people play games?
Every day.
Every day, okay. 6 to 12 hours a week?
Yeah.
Okay. 20 hours a week. So a part-time job.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
It's good game. I'm saying.
Hey, I have probably spent that much time playing Baldur's Gate 3 over the past, 2 months. So that's, it's basically all I want to do. All right, so here are the actual numbers. This is according to the 2023 report from the Entertainment Software Association. They do this every year. It's kind of like a yearly update on our demographics and what these numbers look like. This is specifically in the U.S. That's a really important thing to keep in mind. So in the US, about 65% of Americans play video games. That's 62% of adults, about 76% of minors, 18 and under. This number has been going up. We saw a huge jump during and then post-pandemic, and it doesn't look like it's going to go back down. So about 65% of Americans overall. The balance is currently 53% of gamers identify as men, 46% of gamers identify as women. The people who identify as non-binary in this sample set are under 1%, so they are left out of the conversation, which is actually one of my points. That's bad, especially in terms of representation. But we've got about a 53-46 split right now. Pre-pandemic, this was actually closer to 50-50, which is kind of interesting. And there was a couple years there where we were at 51% women. So it's an interesting shift over the years. Average age, which I didn't ask y'all because I forgot that it was on that list, 32 years old. That's typically feels a little bit older than people would expect. On average, we play about 12.8 hours per week, and about 75% of players play at least 4 hours a week. That would be like the game regularly. I didn't ask about this last question, but this is really important in terms of representation in games. About 96% of people surveyed in this 2023 report said that they found games to be beneficial in some way. The vast majority of people said that gaming brings them joy, or it's a fun hobby, that it helps us de-stress, that some people commented about the cognitive skills that they develop, especially first-person shooter games actually help you develop peripheral vision, right, and reaction time and stuff like that. And one of the big important ones for me is that games help to create community. About 50% of the people in this study said they met a significant like friend or romantic partner through video game play, or that it is something that they share with their community. Okay, so great. We know the brief thing about demographics, about who plays. This is super important for representation because we know that the media that we engage in impacts us. So now let's look at the actual representation in game spaces. So in games, you have two performative options, and this is a generalization. Obviously, there are games that fall outside of this. Generally speaking, over the past decade and a half, we see that you can either be masculine male or feminine female. Trying to behave outside of this binary gets some negative feedback. And so our masculine males, we assume that men are naturally interested in and inhabit the game space, that they are naturally skilled, they are knowledgeable, they like video games, right? We also say that men tend to play or are expected to play damage-dealing roles or protection roles. Women, on the other hand, are feminine females by virtue of the fact that they are not men, are considered to be not natural inhabitants in a game space. We don't expect women to be interested in games or to engage with gameplay or want to do it, and because we're not expecting to see women there, we also assume when women are there that they are unskilled, uninterested, need help, likely to make mistakes. We also say that women are expected to play healing or support roles, so kind of in the background helping the male players do things that they're doing better. This image, those two avatars are actually wearing the same armor pieces. It's the yes, it's the same armor pieces. The female avatar, that's what's called combat lingerie. That's actually what it's called, combat with a K. So that's the same armor set. So what we see is that not only do we have these expectations, it's actually visually reinforced by a lot of the games that we play and a lot of the presentation of masculine and feminine bodies in these spaces. Here are some other examples. These are some of my favorite slides to create. These are popular game characters either over time or recently. We've got Kratos from God of War, who doesn't wear a lot of clothing, but is very beefy and muscular and clearly visually prepared for what he's going to go do. Joel from The Last of Us, appropriately clothed, has a weapon. Bowser, he's spiky. You wouldn't want to run up and punch him. You're going to get hurt, right? He's prepared for the space that he's in, even though he's technically naked.
Coming out of the shell.
Joel and Ellie are always a great comparison point. The Last of Us has done a lot of good stuff for representation. Ellie is one of the main female characters in The Last of Us. She is also appropriately clothed and appropriately clothed for her age. That's new. That is a recent development, which is also why it's a really important one to point out when talking about representation. That is the most recent iteration of Lara Croft. We're doing so much better. She's wearing pants. That's exciting. The first couple of iterations of Lara Croft had a very large chest, a very large rear end, a tiny waist, and almost no clothing. That is not how I would want to go and do all the things that Lara Croft does. She's still in a sleeveless tank top situation. Probably not the best choice, but she's more clothed. She has closer to normal average body proportions, so that's good. And then the third image there is a character from Street Fighter. One of her things is that she kicks a lot. If you notice, her skirt is kind of like a bunch of different pieces, so when she kicks, you can see her underwear. She's a very strong character who is actually well prepared for her situation. However, she is still mostly naked in that situation. Again, that combat lingerie. So this contributes to These kinds of things, remember, our population is almost 50-50, 53-46. So what we're seeing when we interact with this imagery, the media that we consume, that we engage with, impacts how we think about ourselves, others, and how we are supposed to inhabit these game spaces. So research has shown, including my own research, this is one of my areas of focus, that we've got some persistent expectations and stereotypes and regarding gendered expectations in these spaces. That most gamers are men. Men are experts, so seeing that masculine male, men are here, they know what they're doing. Women can't play games, and women don't play games. Two different things there, can't and don't. These are opinions expressed by and experienced by both men and women players. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of research on non-binary identities in gaming. Again, we're talking about representation. That's bad. We should, and that research is starting to come together. We also see, and this is something that's come out of my own research, that the salience of these expectations becomes really important, particularly for women. Right, so the existence of these expectations, these stereotypes are expressed by players as something they're familiar with, even if they themselves don't endorse it. I've had in an interview study, a number of players say, well, like I know the stereotype that women don't play games, I don't believe that, but it's still this persistent belief. So then we have women in these spaces feeling like they shouldn't be there because the expectation is that they're not there. We also know that women tend to like to engage in new activities with a group more often than men do. These are obviously generalizations, comes from gender research, that's kind of looking at that binary. So if we're not seeing women represented in these spaces, women aren't going to join these spaces, which is just perpetuating the idea that women aren't in these spaces. And I'm over my 6 minutes already, but we can also look at this in terms of the industry and what the industry looks like right now. Really, really briefly, there have been, if any of you are gamers, you might have heard of Gamergate. This was persistent harassment that started on areas of Reddit and 4chan against some game designers that spread to game scholars. And this is, people often say like post-Gamergate. We're not post-Gamergate, this is actually still happening. We're just talking about it less in like the ongoing harassment kind of way. More recently, the state of California sued Activision Blizzard, which is the company that makes World of Warcraft, one of the biggest games of its type in the world. It's been around for 16, almost 17 years now. Huge following, though not the biggest game in the world, and this lawsuit is focused on gender discrimination and harassment in the company that is rampant and systemic. That lawsuit is still going on. It was announced and became public in July of 2021, and we've had some really interesting developments, including an entire shakeup of almost all the leadership in the company, and additional claims being added to the lawsuit of Activision Blizzard, destroying all of the evidence they could get their hands on as soon as the lawsuit became public. So part of the reason the lawsuit's still ongoing is because they just keep adding stuff to it. So when we look at representation both in game spaces and in the industry, how women are represented and treated in these spaces, we've got a lot of work to do. It's also important to note that these gendered expectations harm men as well, right? If we have these expectations that men know what they're doing, they're interested, and you identify as a man and don't fit that, you're going to face this violation of expectations. That's also not great. So the question that we come to here is, what can we do as gamers or as people who know gamers to create more inclusive spaces and to kind of combat these persistent beliefs, even when many gamers don't actually endorse them.
So why don't you join me and give the wonderful panelists today another round of applause. And then we would love to take the rest of our time for a question and answer. Don't be shy. Oh, and look, see, there's a microphone too, just for you.
If you don't have questions, then karaoke would be...
Next up, karaoke.
I was gonna ask, how long have you been a video game player?
Me?
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't never use microphones, so I always forget they exist. For me personally, I've actually been playing WoW, World of Warcraft, for about 16 years.
Oh, wow.
On and off, and I played like Pokemon and stuff when I was a kid, then took a big long break and did a lot of things like girls don't play video games, which is very ironic and hilarious now. And now I'm, my partner games a lot, so we play a lot of things together. Like that's kind of my main hobby. So,
I stopped video gaming when I was about 13.
Yeah.
Myself, but I do feel like it was beneficial, like for like you were saying, peripheral vision kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was interesting. And Dr. Scott, like, how do you feel about the representation of minorities within the church, the LDS church?
Well, when you look at the church's main page and their website, they're certainly making a large effort to look more diverse and less white than the actual churches, which is good.
Yeah.
I think where I see some potential problems from the church's website directly versus the church news is that, and this is typical of all public relations, is that they create an idealized notion of what it means to be a good Latter-day Saint, what it means to be a good Latino or African American Latter-day Saint or African Latter-day Saint or what have you. And so those socially constructed ideals then again create the same problem Jessica was talking about in video games, in that there are many people who don't meet those norms, who don't live in upper middle class homes and have all the nice stuff that you see in the background in these pictures, and therefore it can other them effectually by making them feel like they also have not somehow have not accomplished what the representations tell them they ought to have accomplished if they are good believing Latter-day Saints. I think that can create a problem.
Very good, thank you. And then I was going to ask about the menstruation
Sure.
aspect.
Yeah.
So when did you start realizing that you needed to use pads instead of the cloth and stuff like that?
So I've always used pads, and I started using them because I grew up in a more urban setting. My mom was educated. She used pads herself, so she made sure I used them too. But I think the problem that I've realized that there is more to it than just like bleeding is when I was around 20 and went to college and kind of started noticing trends and patterns in my body, which I just was not even aware about that happens. And it used to happen, but it was more like if I would complain to my mom, she would be like, oh, that happens during your periods. Like, don't worry. But how do you navigate those? And thankfully, I was one of those people who didn't have it bad. I know some people who have really bad cramps and they have to like lay down and not even move for the day. So those people exist, and they exist in a huge number, but they are overlooked sometimes. And at least in the context that I have done this study more in, which is back home in India, sometimes given some home remedies and told to just kind of take it as it is. So.
Right. My parents were from the South, and my mom, when she started menstruating, her mom just gave her a book.
Yeah.
And said, here you go, and said nothing else about the whole experience.
Yeah.
And so my mom was kind of like, what am I doing?
Yeah, and I think it's this generational stuff. So I don't know what then your mom must have done a different job with you trying to explain to you. But I think what I was seeing
she was still kind of taboo-ish in a sense.
But maybe more than a book.
Well, I would say I learned more at school with
Sure.
the sex ed videos than I did with at home.
And that's something that we did not have. But what I did learn was that in recent times in India, they have started doing these sex ed classes, which are more about like taking boys in a separate room, women in a separate room, and then
Right.
talking to them about periods and talking to boys about whatever they talk to them. So I don't know what they talk to. I genuinely don't know because I don't know. My brother didn't take any sex ed and other people that I could talk to. So, but the women I talked to, they said that they were just kind of told, this is going to happen to you. Take this free sanitary napkin and please hide it in your socks and don't show it to other people, right? So that was kind of the messaging that people were getting. And
Secretive, being
it's
very
secretive. So it was, while there is messaging and while like in urban schools, sex ed kind of thing is happening, it was still like, hide it though, you shouldn't tell it to anybody. And in my case, I did not know about it because I started menstruating earlier than most other people in my peer group did. So then by that time, my mom had just not prepared herself to tell me about it.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Munz and Dr. Blevins, I apologize. I don't have any questions for you because I came late. So
We forgive you. Who else has a question for the panelists today? Thank you so much. Oh, look, there's some hands. And then we're going to come back over here to all of you. Over here.
So this is kind of for the whole panel. I think all of your topics probably have some sense of like, there's like controversial sides in all of the topics. And I'm just kind of wondering if any of you have something you try to like teach to your students is unethical and people have a harder time like grasping it, if that makes sense.
Am I understanding the question right? Are you asking us if we teach our students to do something unethical? No. I'm confused.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
No, I'm kind of wondering if there's anything you try to teach in ethics and it doesn't really like resonate with people and they don't really understand like why something would be unethical that you're like kind of teaching is unethical.
Is it okay if I go first? Sure. I think for my part, it's I do religion and culture, and so religious values are things people hold very tightly, and so I think sometimes it's challenging to see or critique things that need improvement when we hold things so dearly. And also when it comes to things that have become part of culture wars, that have become politicized, like gender issues, race issues, sexual orientation, all of those topics can become, right? They become challenging to look at them and detach ourselves from our own kind of biases and prejudices or hopes and reflect more and try to be more, representative of different points of view. And I think that's a challenge that we all face. But I think that's probably my hardest class to teach I teach a class called Mormons, Media and Popular Culture, and when we get to stuff on gender and race, that sometimes is challenging, but hopefully informative.
I mean, I think you spoke for all of us in at least that general answer. I think that teaching anytime critical thinking issues can be challenging because students are not receptive towards it, but it's also like you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know. That's why you're in college and it's new ideas. So whenever you're presenting new ideas, I think that's always challenging. And teaching specific classes like communication theory, intercultural communication. I think I have wonderful students in intercultural communication who are here in public too, in the audience. But I think those topics, okay, how do you tread those topics in a way that recognizes that people don't know much, and I may know a little bit more because I'm grown up and I just read all these books to get there, right? So, yeah.
Avery, I don't know if this answers your question, but I often think about the heavy ethical load that I have in my power in that, I'm going to pull this all together, right? You come to class with your narratives about how the world works, and I'm teaching maybe a different narrative, and there is a wild moment where those narratives may be in contradiction or in tension with each other. And anyway, I try to wrap it all together by saying, I need to think about my power. I need to think about the narratives that everyone is coming with, and just know that it's an interesting ethical space to be, if that makes sense. Practically, not to do with conflict, but I teach environmental communication, and I think it's becoming less and less, but people have been hesitant to talk about climate change or talk about the issues around water or drought that we have here in the world, on the planet. And so I would say that I end up with that tension most often, and then I just say, we're in a university, so we're going with science on this one. So I don't know if that answers, but it's a really fascinating question that you ask, and I think that where power narrative come together in ethics is that question is right in there. So very profound.
Really quick, for me, the biggest challenge is not necessarily with the ethical topics. Oftentimes students or just audience members at conferences and stuff simply don't believe the harassment happens, which is fascinating. And it's getting better, but it's still going on. So those conversations are difficult to navigate in classroom settings. And like when I teach about video games, we talk about Gamergate, we talk about the lawsuit, and the narrative that I'm typically getting from my students is like, okay, well that one thing happened, and it's like, no, this is really broad and systemic, and it seems at odds with our percentages and our balances for who plays. But when you start looking at genre and like where harassment will typically happen, what kinds of games, it becomes a lot clearer. It's mostly social games and places where we have potential for interaction, which is primarily what men play. So we start looking at that balance. And also, this conversation is difficult to have without it sounding like I'm saying men players are bad. I'm not saying that. If that's how it came across, I didn't mean that. I'm not saying that. That makes the conversation challenging as well.
So my first question is for Dr. Scott or Brother Dave. Hold on. So you were going over simple, primitive, and cultural tropes, and we just went over model minority theory. Is there a tie with that, or is that just another name for that theory?
Yeah, I think the quote that talked about Black Africans being hard workers who will walk miles and miles and miles when they feel the spirit. I think that's an example of a model minority discourse, right? It's suggesting, look at these people, and it's kind of paternalistic, but I think there's some elements of that theory that you could apply there for sure. And then you're right, because that theory has a contradictory discourse. On the one hand, people are good and overcoming all of this stuff, and it means they're becoming more like us, the white people, the Westerners, and therefore they're overcoming adversity, right? But the adversity, again, is the result in part of colonialism and white oppression historically and so on. But so yeah, I think there's some overlap there, but I don't see it quite the same as you see with model minority theories that applies like in the United States to African Americans and Asians and so forth, just because there's a different dynamic here in the United States specifically, right? Because this is a group now of immigrants in the United States who have had to fight the culture in order to, for resources and so forth. So I think it's a little different, but I can see that.
Okay, and I got one more question, and it's for Dr. Rawat. So you were saying that social taboos were still creating barriers for getting help and participating in society in India. Are you seeing some similar things in America? I know it's probably totally different with like certain taboos, but do you still see, if you've done research with America and menstruation health, do you still see that here in the US?
Yeah, so I think I haven't published on that, but when I collected data at my previous university with students, like you just talked about model minority stuff, right? But US is a country of immigrants. So we have people from all over the world, and they preserve their culture in good ways, and some of the traditions, which includes these taboos, are also kind of passed on. So while they are not as prevalent and as predominantly like making people do certain things, but I think that there were many participants who were discussing similar things, like, oh, this is how I was told about this. But I would say mostly I saw positive, conversation. So for example, I had many participants who had moved to attend university in the United States, which is how like a lot of migrants do come to the United States as well. And they were talking about how it was very liberating to see things like, oh, like we can talk about menstruation, oh, that we have free pads in the university bathrooms, right? Because that was like a really big deal for them to not have to feel hesitant about it, which they may have felt in different parts of the world that they come from. So it exists, but it maybe exists in different ways. I think what in the US gets overlooked is the idea that, not everybody has the access to sanitary napkins. I think we assume we do because we see that around. We can go and purchase it from a CVS or from a store, but there are many people who actually still can't afford period products. And that did come up where they were like, oh, we go and buy something that's cheaper because that's just more, it's easier to handle that. Or we will not talk about medical conditions because we will be put on birth control that does not work for us in any other way, right? So there are still issues that they experience where they can't talk about their health, or many times they can't afford sanitary napkins, which something is not, I think, fully discussed. And I think this change is coming. Like it happened in Utah, it's happening in other states, but it has long been the problem.
I hate how expensive period products are.
Yeah, exactly. They are.
I just want to anecdotally say, I mean, I think we're of different generations. Are you a millennial? And
35, I'm millennial.
okay, well, so I'm like 10 years older than you, and I was sitting here the whole time you were talking, thinking, she's so brave to talk about periods in front of all of these people. As like a middle-aged woman, I still am like, oh my gosh, this is such an embarrassing, and it's not at all, right? And so I would say even that's, who knows if that's generational or what that changes, but like how incredible that this amazing woman is up here speaking about this. I mean, because in junior high, that would have been my nightmare. Like, even right now, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's so brave. So, yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Robinson, and I don't know exactly how to phrase this, so hopefully it comes out right. But basically, in terms of gaming, how often does the discussion of like categories of games, whether it be like first-person shooter games or like puzzle games, how often does that come into the conversation?
Frequently is the answer to that. So we actually see differences in representation depending on game genre, not only of how male and female bodies are represented in those spaces and if there's even a non-binary option, but also who plays what. Women tend to, by a wide margin, play puzzle games. So think like Tetris or pretty much anything you have on your phone falls into that category. Whereas we see men dominate in first-person shooters and in MOBAs, multi-user online battle arenas, games like League of Legends. Fortnite and games like that, battle royales, are hilariously about 50-50. So are MMOs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPGs like World of Warcraft, about 50-50. So obviously interaction is different in these games. If you're playing Tetris by yourself, it's very unlikely that you're going to get harassed in that setting because you're playing a puzzle game by yourself. But any games where we have interaction, joining voice chat or being on a team with people you don't know or competing against people you don't know, there's that opportunity for those things to happen. And it is a minority of players. That's also an important thing to point out. It's just a loud minority. There are many players who identify as women or non-binary people who have had harassment experiences. But then thinking about genre and representation, we also have games like, this shocks everyone all the time, The Sims is the most progressive game ever produced by a huge margin. Because of the play with gender and you can pick your attributes and it's not, for your sim, it's not linked to whether they are male or female in terms of their genitalia and other, secondary sex characteristics. You can kind of do whatever you want, especially The Sims 4, best game for representation out there, right? Other games are trying, there's the genital selector in Baldur's Gate 3, if anyone's playing Baldur's Gate 3, but you also have binary options in a lot of the other places. You've only got masculine or feminine body types, you can't do anything in between, you don't have sliders, so you're just picking pre-designed body types. So yeah, genre comes into the conversation a lot in terms of both interaction, but also character design and who we're seeing represented and in what ways in those game spaces.
I just have one last question, I promise. So, Dr. Robinson, do you see a correlation of military, do you see, not to be like Ender's Game or anything like that, but you know how that all worked out. But so is there a correlation between playing video games and joining the military? Has that been done?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any research that looks at that. However, the U.S. Armed Forces have used Call of Duty as a recruitment tool.
That's exactly what I was curious about.
Yeah. I don't know what the statistics are, though, in terms of people playing those games and then joining, or vice versa, being a member of the armed forces and then starting to play those games. But I do know that one thing, you can't learn how to actually use weapons from any of the games in which you use weapons. It's not a realistic representation or recreation, even though a lot of people actually do think that, players and non-players. But yeah, I don't know is the short answer.
Are you wanting to do any research in that, or has anybody done research?
I'm sure there is research on it. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I'm more about the like gender and identity construction in game spaces and like team formation. Like I've been on a raid team for the past 3 years that I'm one of the leaders for, so like leadership and resilience and stuff like that in those spaces.
Jessica, I'm sorry, can I ask you? Oh, is there an audience?
And I think Max.
Oh, okay, I was going to ask Jessica.
And
a
then you,
follow-up.
Brother Dave.
It's okay. No, go ahead.
Dr. Blevins, I have a question. When you're thinking about ethics and conflict, what kind of ethical considerations do you think are different in like intimate conflict, so like romantic partners, friendships, families, versus workplace or non-intimate conflict? Like what should we be thinking about in those different spaces when we're thinking about conflict and ethics?
Great question, and I would love to hear what you have to say about this. But I think when we enter the workplace, we need to think about power even more. I mean, there is absolutely power that is in our intimate relationships. We experience that throughout our life cycle with our parents, right? So when we're young, they have more power. In the middle of life, maybe it's equal, who knows, it changes all the time. And then as your parents are aging, you may have more power in that situation. So that power still comes into those relationships. But I think at work, we can often I think one of the ethical considerations is often we don't acknowledge the power that we have for a myriad of reasons. But I think maybe in our culture, we're a little embarrassed to admit we have power, or I also think we grow into our power and we might not realize it. I've told my classes before that I sometimes think I do a lot of damage in this world because I walk around not acknowledging the power that I have. And so I think that at a workplace when there are material considerations like how much money you're making, when promotions and who is getting promotions come into play, I would just think that the power really has to be considered. But I would say that thinking through power in any conflict is probably a good idea, but I would say at workplace, if you can be even more cognizant of it, then we're able to just make work. We can all probably think of an experience at work where someone had power and wielded it unethically and it made our life harder in some way. And again, that happens in your interpersonal relationships, but it can be so damaging at work.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Robinson. So I play Valorant competitively for the UVU esports team.
Nice.
And I know with Valorant they have in the like higher leagues and the pro competitive leagues, they have like men are separated from the women's league. So there's a like Grand Champions League for women and non-binary players. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that as far as like separating that at the highest level into gender categories.
That is a great question, and that is actually one of like, in terms of like video game research and like esports research, that's our nature versus nurture question. Like it's that level, not even kidding. That kind of gender division comes from gender division in physical sport. And it's kind of, we're trying to figure out what the heck esports is in the like language and in the kind of landscape of competitive sports. The only model we have is physical sport, so we're kind of taking the same things and doing the same things. Realistically, there could be physical differences between players who identify as men, women, and non-binary people. It's not going to matter as much as it does in physical sport. It's going to be more about reaction time, peripheral vision, like tactical thinking. It's definitely different. So there's, I think, a case to make, to have the gendered leagues that might also reinforce this idea that men are natural inhabitants and women and non-binary people are not. But that's also a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. If you are interested in learning about that, I would suggest Googling Steph Orme, O-R-M-E. She's like the esports person in game studies. So, but yeah. Also, good luck.
Professor Robinson, I was actually curious a little bit. When you say puzzle games and so forth are more catered, at least are more distributed with women as opposed to men, are you also including strategy games in that? Like, for example, Rome Total War, or I was a big Hearts of Iron 4 fan growing up, still am.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, that's why I have a big history interest. But anyways, Just games like that. Are those included in puzzles, or are they included in a different category? And if not, what's the distribution like in those kind of games?
Good question. So genre classification is in a weird position right now. We're seeing more games that are cross-genre. Like the fact that we can call Fortnite a battle royale game is new. We had to create a genre to talk about what the heck Fortnite even is. So puzzle games would be things like your classic Tetris or like Diner Dash or a lot of the mobile games that we play, but not, you're talking about strategy games that are either real-time strategy games or tactical strategy games like tower defense, like that kind of stuff. Those are kind of loosely grouped under the strategy like umbrella. They're kind of action adventure, but not really because they don't necessarily have a storyline. But that is a little bit more male dominated, but it's close to equal. Part of this is also like one of the reasons that puzzle games are played primarily by women is the question of access. So one of the things that comes along with this representation, if we expect boys and men to be interested in video games, you're much more likely, boys and men, to be gifted or to like approve the purchase of platforms to play on. Xbox, PlayStation, Game Boy, whereas women, again, by virtue of the fact that we're not men, not likely to have that. So women oftentimes start accessing games for the first time via smartphone. So if you think about the kinds of games you can access on that platform, that's already into, okay, what am I actually able to access? And that explains a little bit of the divide and like why puzzle games are more popular among women.
Okay, first off, thank you. This has been so awesome. I've loved all of your guys' topics, so thank you so much. I feel like this question is probably for the great Maria and for Dr. Robinson. So my fiance loves video games and anime and is just so enthralled in that world. And I'm so the opposite and not. I grew up playing Mario Kart, so if that counts, yes. I like to think I'm pretty decent. But it's been interesting because it's been really fun. We really are truly polar opposites, and we have things in common, like the important things I would say, but not like he loves anime and all of those things, right? Which is great, but I want to be able to participate in those. But I think something that's hard for me is feeling like in video games or anime, I know I'm kind of throwing that in, I do feel like as somebody who identifies as a woman, I do feel like those very much so objectify women and how they look and just like, so I don't know, I guess like just for the two of you, like, you know, not that there's been any kind of a conflict, but just being able to like talk about that, or like, do you think there's any hope for like video games in the future that it's like I could play without feeling like I'm playing with this girl who has giant boobs and a giant ass?
Do you want to start?
I mean, I would just say like, what an awesome opportunity to start a dialogue, right? And so maybe as one of the, you know, ways to get power is your interpersonal skills. Approaching this is like, I care about you and you clearly care about this, and I'd love an access point, but here is a way that I'm not feeling super comfortable in this. Like, what do you think about this representation? What do you think this says about femininity, right? Maybe bring in some of the research that's coming in, or, you know, bring up some of the papers. But this just seems like an awesome opportunity to connect in a deeper way and maybe find that game that you would enjoy together. And I'll give it to you now.
I agree. This is a great opportunity for dialogue and to talk about those kinds of things. Oftentimes, and this is kind of true of privilege in general, we don't think a lot about the positions of privilege that we occupy and how those impact literally everything about our world. So things that you're seeing in game spaces like objectification and body design and things like that, your partner might not have noticed. Mine doesn't notice it. We talk about it all the time though, because he's dating me. Big mistake. Anyway, in terms of hope for future games, short answer, yes. Game designers are finally listening to audiences who are saying we want more realistic body types. We want more options in terms of body types. I want to be able, as a woman, to play a game where, sure, if I want to wear the combat lingerie for the lols, absolutely. But if I don't want to wear it, I need to have that option. And we're seeing more and more of that kind of baked into our games. Like Baldur's Gate is a great example of this. Baldur's Gate 3, you only have, and I have many issues with this, you only have masculine or feminine, large or small body types for every race, but they're realistic body types. They're the kind of people that you'd expect to be adventurers in this world full of magic and dragons. Like they're all fairly muscular, but they're not, the female body types or the feminine body types are not overly sexualized. You can find armor that is if you want to, or like just make them run around in their underwear, but it's not the default for the game. And having that choice, I think, is where we're gonna go. So we're still gonna be able to objectify our female and male body types in game spaces, but it's not gonna be the default, hopefully, as games move on. And we're seeing more and more of that kind of, that option be built into games.
So I had a question for Dr. Robinson. This is a bit of a tangent, but what I was thinking of is, so the movie Encanto, and how Disney was not expecting so many girls to love Luisa. They were expecting her to, and I wanted to just think of like, what are your thoughts on that? Of they had no idea how big she was going to be because she's muscular, she's strong, and she's also feminine, and she's fully clothed. Do you think that's going to assist the gaming world?
Yes. So a lot of people who work in animation and like art design cross the border between animated movies, animated television shows, and video games. So we're seeing a lot of the same artists doing art for movies, for TV, for video games, and kind of bringing those conversations across that line. And also, quite frankly, video game companies want people to buy their games. So if they see something that's working or that's attracting a larger audience, like characters that are not tropey feminine, tropey masculine, but kind of cross that barrier and have kind of diverse personalities and attributes, like real people do, we're more likely to see that kind of stuff in movies and television and also in our game spaces. So, yeah.
I can't leave you out, Brother Dave. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you said with the church's, like specifically the church's charitable portrayals in Africa, for example. As a straight white male Republican who lives in the Midwest, who also happens to be a member of the church.
We're not all perfect, man.
I have to ask, so when it comes to maybe representing those charitable efforts and attempting to avoid, say, that model minority talk, do you think it's maybe purposeful? Do you think it's maybe unpurposeful, maybe ignorance? And if so, depending on whichever there, what's a good strategy the church could use to perhaps avoid that?
Yeah, that was my last slide, right? Those are the big questions, because it does create a conundrum, right? How do you provide service to people in need, which the church obviously does a lot of, and celebrate that and tell others about that without fully objectifying the people for whom you're giving the service. That's a challenge, right? That's a difficult thing to do. So I think generally they do, again, the church's website itself, I think, does a pretty good job of doing that. But I do think, I do think that on the other hand, maybe more transparency would be good. Because I think sometimes, and this is how PR works, right? You want to represent the best of what you're doing. You want to have it reflect on the image of the institutional church, the overall church. So, for example, they'll say, the church just gave $1 million for X, Y, and Z. But what they don't do is say, of that $1.1 million, or whatever, 1 million of that came directly from church members who donated it through the Fast Offering Fund. I think that kind of transparency would be useful and very good for the church, especially in the current political climate where some recent kind of scandals and stories have come out about the church and its money and its wealth and resources, which plays into, right, this notion of the church as an institutional behemoth with money and power that it's abusing. I think if the church were more transparent about where the money and resources are coming from, both from the local membership and membership from all over the world, I think that would be in their best interest, just as a PR strategy, as well as perhaps a better way of showing the church more as a global organization of people, not just a Salt Lake City institution that's sending stuff out there to the rest of the world.
This question is primarily for Dr. Blevins, but I'm sure that the other three have other good things to say about this as well. We as human beings see having power as a very good thing, and the more power you have, like, kind of the better person you are, right? But in order to, I think, get more diversity and understand the ethics of diversity, we do kind of have to let go of some of that power, and we have to empower others. So what are some ways that we can frame either empowering others or letting go of that power in a positive way so that we can encourage others to do the same and do it in a way that's not condescending as well?
Yeah, I mean, when you have that answer, write that book. It's going to be so good. I think personally what I try to do is acknowledge the places that I have power. I think, like I said before, a lot of us don't want to acknowledge the power that we have in the world, and then also look around and see who might not have that power. And it's hard to do, right? I think all three of these case studies set us up really well to see, like, hey, I live in a body that doesn't menstruate. Maybe you haven't thought about access or the budgetary parts, or do you have access to pads or tampons, or however it is that you take care of that, right? Maybe as Dr. Scott just talked about, like, are we thinking about how transparency is working? What is to be gained there when we think about how representation happens, right? Is this a conversation you can have with your partners and talk about? So I think a lot of us, and I put myself right at the center of that, live our lives sort of not noticing where people don't have power. And so my hope is to recognize my power and then to recognize how I can empower others. And I would hope that by example, other people see that that's great. But you're right, we have some real narratives, connecting narrative again, about power is this thing we hold on to, right? And what happens if we change that idea? What if power actually grows the more we share it? I say, as the department hippie, I guess, I don't know.
I just want to quickly chime in, listening, like deeply listening and taking the time to listen and then reflect on that listening, because that's probably one of the ways in which you can even understand what the lack of power may look like and how it impacts people. So, yeah.
I think that's it.
Please join me in thanking Stevie and all of the panelists for their contribution. Okay, we'll reconvene in 15 minutes.